Alright everyone, I want to welcome you all back to some more of The Great Ace Attorney 2. After finding out about that odd twist about Gregson, I don't like the possibility of him being a possible traitor of sorts. I'm hoping that's not the case, if anything. So we're going to continue on and find out what's what and see how it all comes about. So with all that said guys, let's keep it going. Alright guys, and we are back. Now it's time for us to move on to Vigil's hospital bed. 2nd of November, St. Sinner's Hospital, Ward number 3. This is the ward where Mr. Vigil was brought, apparently. To be frank, I'm a little worried about seeing him again. Ah, the lawyer. Hello again. Are you feeling better now, Mr. Vigil? Yes, thank you. Somewhat better. I'm so sorry to have caused you to... I mean, it was because of me. If I hadn't exposed your secret and forced you to remember things you'd obviously tried to forget. The prosecutor was here until a few moments ago, too. You just missed him. Oh, Kazuma beat us to it? He said much the same as you. He was very apologetic. But the truth is, I brought all this upon myself. Please, don't think like that. Keeping it from Evie, my wife, all these years, I've carried such a sense of guilt. But that's not the worst of it. Over time, I obviously came to deceive myself as well. What is with this gesture of his? You mean, about your dismissal? Looking back now, I'm beginning to think that perhaps Inspector Gregson didn't stumble across me by accident at all. I mean, he compensated me so generously for acting as a stand-in. He was clearly concerned for my well-being and doing what he could to help. So perhaps Gregson knew exactly what had become of Mr. Vigil all along then. I'm sure this is just desserts for 10 years of lies and deception, but... it wasn't me that helped the professor escape 10 years ago. It wasn't me. I swear it. I swear it's true. Oh, Mr. Vigil. I'm sure you'd rather not dredge up even more from your past at this time, but if possible, could you tell us exactly what really happened? I want to. I need to get all of this off my chest. I just want someone to tell me what I should have done. That's why we need to converse with you, sir. Inspector Gregson was obviously engaged in a special operation of some sort. He was investigating something that even Scotland Yard couldn't know about. Details of the Reapers are marks, yes. It was when he had to carry out all those investigations that I would take his identification and impersonate him. We'd pretend to be the inspector and carry out investigations on his behalf. Oh no, never! A common street peddler couldn't possibly carry out a proper police investigation. All I would do is go to a specified location and make a little hoo-ha. Just something to leave an impression, so everyone there would think a detective called Gregson was here. So, that's what you were doing on the day prior to the incident? Yes. He asked me to make an appearance at the park on Lime Street for the Red-Headed League event. So as usual, I flashed the inspector's identification around and was very vocal about my presence. But then you were taken prisoner by those red-headed fraudsters. Yes. So you would always make a point of showing Gregson's identification and generally being loud. That's what the inspector asked me to do, yes. Well, that's one way of becoming a legendary detective, I suppose. Not a good one, though. And as you know, I suffered this bruising around my neck at their hands. But the following day, they kept their word and released me. Without returning the inspector's identification to you, however. We had arranged to meet in Fresno Street room at 5 that day so I could report back to the inspector. But the agreed time, that's when I heard the gunshot. It was at midnight on 17th June, 10 years ago. That was the time scheduled for the execution. But the professor's execution never actually took place, did it? Or rather, the execution itself must have been used to effect the plan of escape. I hardly dare to imagine what a chilling plan it was. Barclay was renowned for being the highest security prison in the country. Everything that went in or out of the place was searched multiple times. But there was one notable exception. Or rather, one notable loophole. Something that was never questioned. I have a feeling I know what that loophole was now. The coffins into which the bodies of the executed convicts were placed, correct? Yes. Once the coroner had confirmed the death of a condemned convict, the body was taken in its coffin for immediate burial in Lowgate Cemetery just behind the prison. The chief warder first had to sign the necessary papers. And after that, no member of the staff was permitted to touch the coffin containing the body again. When execution took place, only the executioner and the coroner were permitted inside the chamber. I would wait in the adjacent room for word that the condemned convict was dead. On that occasion, once I had that confirmation, I went to the mortuary to find a lone coffin as usual. The procedure was that I would sign the paperwork, having checked the coffin, then nail it shut. But for some reason that day, the coffin was already nailed shut. No! I didn't think anything of it at the time. I assumed that my deputy must have checked the coffin and nailed it shut before I arrived. So, you mean, the coffin contained... Yes, I can only imagine that Asogi, having escaped this execution somehow, was alive inside the coffin. The coffin was then taken out through the main gates and deposited in Lowgate Cemetery. Presumably, there wouldn't have been enough air inside to breathe for long. So in the early hours following the burial, somebody dug up the coffin again to set Genshin free. But in the end, he was fatally shot in the graveyard anyway. What on earth really happened in Lowgate Cemetery that night, I wonder? I'm afraid I really don't know. All I can say with certainty are two things. Asogi couldn't possibly have escaped that way without help from somebody working in the prison. And that somebody was not me. The convict Asogi. Obviously you knew the man then. The professor, I mean. Genshin Asogi. Yes, I remember him well, in fact. Would you mind telling us what you know? Well, having been condemned to death as he was, any contact I had with the man was short, obviously. After that trial, which was carried out behind closed doors attended only by the elite members of the judiciary, they called for his execution to be carried out at the earliest possible opportunity. The outcome of the trial was set from the beginning, wasn't it? It was a time of delicate diplomacy when Britain and Japan were in the process of signing an important treaty. That meant that the potentially destabilizing case had to be dealt with swiftly and discreetly. The man had less than a week in total. As I was chief warder, I oversaw his short stay in the cells until his final hour. I remember being struck deeply by his noble character and incredible resilience. What do you mean exactly? He was a killer of many men, but he was always quiet and polite. He was a gentleman, and a man of intellect. In fact, I couldn't bring myself to believe what he'd done, so I'd asked him one day. Those 5 members of the aristocracy whose lives were taken, were you really responsible? I'm guilty of the unforgivable crime of ending another human's life, yes. The following day, the closed trial took place, and the verdict was no surprise. Guilty. That night, when he was brought back to his cell, I saw something. Something unusual. Something unusual. What? The last will and testament of Genshin Asogi. As I said, it was on the night following his trial after he'd been found guilty. I was doing the rounds of the cells, and when I looked into Asogi's, I noticed that he seemed to have a sheet of paper in his hand. Ah, his will and testament then, presumably. As soon as he noticed me, he hurriedly shoved it behind his back. But Why did you find that so unusual? Isn't it normal for a man to pen a will when he knows his death is nigh? Yes, that's true, but there were special conditions to Asugi's incarceration, you see. What sort of conditions? Well, even though he was held in a cell designed for condemned inmates, he was allowed to keep his personal effects with him, with one exception. Really, he was allowed his things. That is unusual, certainly. Of course, he'd been convicted of killing 5 members of the aristocracy, but at the same time, he was a guest in our country from the Empire of Japan. The powers that be were determined that his final days shouldn't be needlessly uncomfortable. And what was the exception you mentioned to the personal effects he was allowed? That's the point. He wasn't permitted to have writing materials, specifically no pens or paper. So, he was prevented from leaving any written record of what had happened to him. Yes, that was the long and short of it. I have no idea where he obtained that paper. Any writing materials would have been confiscated from him upon his incarceration. As I said, he hid the paper behind his back and then he pleaded with me. What did you just hide behind your back? Please, please turn a blind eye. This is my lifeline. But you know it's against the rules. You're the only person who's seen if you just agree to keep quiet. Alright then, but what's on that paper? A last will and testament. This will is the only weapon I have left now. How can a will be a weapon? So I decided to pretend I'd seen nothing, and I let him keep his will. But then later, it just seemed to vanish without trace. What? What do you mean it vanished? It would seem that isn't the end of the story of this mysterious will. The will's disappearance. I was the only person who saw Asugi's will, but somehow it disappeared. It was after Asugi's execution, which was actually an elaborate jailbreak. The warders gathered up Asugi's possessions that were in his cell. They were all to be sent back to his family home in Japan, you see. To poor Kazuma-sama. And you're saying that it wasn't anywhere to be found among his personal effects. The will, I mean. That's right, though I didn't search through them myself. But Governor Kaiden was livid. He was screaming, it can have disappeared completely. That doesn't quite make sense though, does it? In what way? Well, we'd understood that only Mr. Vigil was aware of the will's existence. In which case, how did the prisoner governor know to look for it? Oh, yes, you're right. I really don't know how he knew, but it certainly seemed as though he knew of the will's existence from the outset. Only he didn't refer to it as a will. What he said was... the Asogi papers. The Asugi papers. I really can't tell you anything of the subsequent events. Because, well, of what happened. Your dismissal, and the way you blocked it all from your memory. I'd forgotten all of this until today. I don't suppose it's relevant to the case, though. Well, anyway, thank you very much for sharing it with us, Mr. Vigil. We're very grateful. I'm afraid there's really little more I can tell you. My wife Evie will be here shortly, so I do hope I don't appear rude, but... No, not at all. Thank you again. But what will become of you now? Well, impersonating a police officer is a criminal offense, of course. I imagine that once I'm fully recovered, I shall be arrested. I'm so sorry. Don't be, please. This was all my own doing. I always knew that this day would come. Well, I wish you well. Goodbye, Mr. Vigil. Ah! Before you go, there's just one thing. Oh, yes? What is it? The Asugi papers. I'd be very grateful if you'd make no mention of the things I told you about them. Presumably for some good reason. It's my understanding that their very existence is a closely guarded secret. If it became known that I'd remembered, well, it could be rather troublesome, I think. I understand. Some sort of will that Genshin Asugi penned just before his death, which the man himself claimed was his last weapon. I wonder, perhaps it had something to do with his plan to escape. If there's anyone who might know more about a document that Kazuma's father left behind, it would be Mr. Vigil's governor. And we know precisely where we must go. Back to Barclay Prison. Alright, let's go. Prison Governor's Office. Second of November, Barclay Prison Governor's Office. Here we go again. Did he always have that scar on the back of his head? I was too busy, like, distracted by the back, man. His back is, like, crazy huge. Ugh, back again, are you? Yes, hello. I've heard all about your investigations. I read the report just now. You found them, huh, Vigil? Yes, luckily. Well, anywho, the laddie doesn't work here no more, so your case is not to do with Barclay. I wouldn't like you to get the wrong idea about that. Of course, yes, Mr. Vigil stopped working here 10 years ago now, so... Yes, we've seen his dismissal notice, haven't we? He was given the chop. Aye, Kimmer, you can very well. So how about a wee handcuff biscuit? Oh, they really are like little handcuffs, and as hard as irons, too. So, what's brought you doing here today? Well, there's something else we'd like to ask you about, actually. That's so. We believe there might have been a document that disappeared from Genshin Asugi's cell. I think it's been called the Asugi Papers or something. Did I no say, Gregson's death is not to do with things that might have happened at Barclay. Leave the past in the past, laddie. Let's not foot our boot with irrelevant details. His expressions changed completely. We're clearly onto something here. Now we're gonna have to converse with you, sir. 10-year-old legacy. That murderous botched execution and the whole miserable escape. They were Barclay's darkest hour, aye. A shocking embarrassment. Because the convict had a collaborator on the prison staff, you mean? Aye, for shame. The coroner who confirmed the death of the man after his execution, Courtney Sith. And my chief warder at the time, Vigil, who was in charge of the whole affair. But Mr. Vigil says he didn't know anything about it. The rascal who wouldn't say otherwise, huh? More handcuffs? Oh, how could I say no? You can never have too much iron in your diet. When Mr. Vigil was handed his dismissal notice as a result of what had happened, he was so despairing. He jumped out of your office window, didn't he? I didn't like to say, but that's just Vigil trying to get out of it. Do you not think he wouldn't have jumped from the shock of his crimes being exposed, eh? I do. You wouldn't say otherwise, though, would you? Of course, I cannot shun all responsibility myself. I shouldn't have let him deceive me. Actually, there's barely anybody that kens what went on at the time now. We Gregson have been murdered and Dr. Sid forbidden from having any visitors. No visitors? Someone obviously doesn't want her giving anything away. Well, we're not going home empty-handed. And I wouldn't dream of sending you packing without Kimmer. Here, take a handcuff or two. Oh, well, it would be rude to say no. Wouldn't want to become anemic. I suppose if there's anybody who might still ken about what had happened back then, it'd be that lass from Forensic Division, Maria Gore. Maria Gore. Aye, Sid's daughter. She didn't have no more, just the one. But the wee bairns followed in her mom's footsteps. You didn't ever see her without a scalpel in her hand. Ah. Mama, what is this? Ugh, where'd she spring from? And did you just call the doctor Mama? Dr. Sid's daughter, Maria Gore. We could do with talking to her. So, she's Dr. Sid's daughter, but her surname is Gore. Aye, there's some family history, I'm sure, but I didn't ken the ins and outs of it. She grew up watching her mom working with the bodies of folk who died in strange circumstances, and decided to do the same with her own life. I cannot understand it myself. Perhaps she was driven by a deep respect for her mother. Perhaps. Anywho, she was in charge of Gregson's autopsy, I believe. Right, and the coroner responsible for this incomplete report. Someone told me once that the wee lassie always loved her mom's stories about cutting up bodies. There's even a rumor that she used to listen to the funeral march as a lullaby. Well then perhaps, her mother might have told her about the autopsy from the case 10 years ago. Aye, I'd say there's a fighting chance at least. After all, that was a life-changing case for all of us. We really need to speak to Miss Gore herself about this, I think. Well, thank you very much. I'm not happy about any part of this. It took years for Londoners to finally forget the whole professor business. Can you not get up on this, laddie? Stop asking pointless questions. I'm sorry, I don't like dredging up these painful memories for everyone. Can you just no stay away, no? Leave me alone and then come back here, eh? Nope, I gotta ask about the Asogi papers. How do you come to kin about that, laddie? There's no many folk even here in the prison who have heard those papers. Ah, well, I can't tell. Mr. Vigil told me. I'm afraid our sources must remain confidential, sir. We've been led to believe the papers are actually a last will and testament. Is that right? The professors, or rather Genshin Asogi's. Aye, that's right. You were well informed, Jimmy. Oh, is that the end of the silent treatment? But then after the convict's execution, it mysteriously vanished from the cell, didn't it? Havers, no. You're off at a half-cock there. I think you didn't quite get your facts straight. It was there in the cell, exactly where it should have been. Oh. Not what we've heard elsewhere. Let me just have a wee poke around in here, and I'm sure I can find it. Ah, here you are. See? The last will and testament of Genshin Asogi, written with a calligraphy brush. Of course I cannot read a word of those Japanese squiggles, but I mind it says he leaves all his worldly possessions to his son back in his homeland. Yes, that's correct. That's the gist of it. So these are the Asogi papers. Aye, of course they are. Papers written by Asogi, no doubt about it. There's no mystery here, laddie. That's your lot. After all this dramish, or the slash there of execution. Wow, that's a hard thing to read, man. We sent the man's possessions back to his clan in Japan, and that was the end of it. I think we ought to make a record of this, Mr. Naruhodo, just in case. One thing of four, you go on your way, Mr. Naruhodo. Oh, yes? Those papers are not to do with Gregson's death. I'd prefer it if you didn't make no mention of them outside the office, or rather... I wouldn't just prefer it. Consider it an order from the highest levels of our government. I understand. Okay, well, that's that. Alright guys, I'm going to end the video here for today. Thank you all for watching. When we come back, as usual, we're going to continue on with the investigation and see it through.